Yes, I want to say this. If you see a name there like Hatshepsut, does any one of you know anything about what is this? Is it a nation, a term, or it's a what? It's a person. Yes, it's a person. If you can put down just basically, just a few words describe who this person was. Associate this person with, anybody know? Egypt. Just simply put, if you just put a queen of Egypt, or even if you put the only queen of Egypt we know about during this period, just enough. Now, if you do something like for Cro-Magnon, put down a tool used for prying lids open or for prying up boxes for Cro-Magnon. Sorry, I can't count that. You've mixed up Cro-Magnon with crowbar. But if there's any way at all I can count it right, I will. Pharaoh, again, that's an Egyptian term. If you simply say name of all the Egyptian kings, simply something like that. And again, I don't guarantee that this class will get any of these, but one of the two classes will get them. You will not be answering the same questions the other class is.
So all the questions for that test are going to be.
They're basically somewhat similar to this. Now there is one question about which nation was the first nation to use iron. I'm going to mention that before the lecture is out, if I get to it. But which nation was the Hittites? And another question, and this one will be much harder than the others. I listed on the board about 5 things that you must have to be considered civilized. I want you to try to remember 3 of them. But again, either your class will get that one or the other class. So don't come and say, you said this was on the test. Well, yes it is, and maybe no it isn't. But I'm not giving you the same questions I will give the warning class. All right. Any other questions? Yes?
Do we get a study guide on this test?
Not for the test, no. And the study guide is the lectures I've been going over for already 3 class periods, and this is, 3, and this is the 4th.
So how can we study for the test?
Oh man, please. Okay. All right, that is a good question. You study by going over the stuff I've written on the board. You study by, if you have to, listen to lectures. Otherwise, you study by reading the book. That's a really good question. But again, the problem with study guides, folks, is you start depending on them to the point where you don't read the book. And that's my main reason why I quit using them some years ago. I used to use them. This brings up a bad memory. 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago, the use of study guides cost me a job at another college. But I had a hard time getting myself weaned from them, and I've had a harder time getting my students weaned. But somehow or other, it seems like you expect them. But I believe you'll learn more and do better if I say, read the book, listen to the lectures, and take notes.
Do you require any material that we have to bring, like a blue book or anything?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. No blue book. All the answers will be written on the test paper on both the pass, and I'm really glad you asked that. Yeah, just write it out. You don't have to bring a blue book. You don't have to bring a Scantron. Now that'll change later. At least I know the final exam will be multiple choice. That much I can promise. But otherwise, I'm trying to get away from multiple choice because I found out, believe it or not, that my students tended to do better on a test like this. Again, if you've listened and you know anything at all about what these things are, you should do well on the test. All right, any other questions? Okay. All right, we'll start. Egypt. Some Egyptologists believe that Egypt's climate, and of course Egypt's geography had a lot to do with the making of Egypt, but Egypt's climate is extremely regular and extremely predictable. You seldom have a cloud in the sky, and when you do have, they don't amount to much. Maybe once every 100 years there'll be a storm, a rainstorm of sorts. But otherwise, the sun always comes up to a clear sky and always sets again to a clear sky. When the sun sets, of course, the stars come out, and the stars are always, seemingly orderly, neat. And some people say that this orderliness led the Egyptians to believe that when the gods made the earth, they made Egypt first and made it perfect, divided it right into with the Nile down the middle, and then made the rest of the world as an afterthought. But Egypt looked on themselves like all humans do, as we're the top, we're the number one in creation, we were first made. And this led to a problem, though. To try to prove that they were the oldest civilization, they distorted their history by trying to make it longer than it actually was. They would take kings whom they knew ruled concurrently. You know, this king was ruling here at the same time this king was ruling here. But they would try to put them end to end to make their history longer than it was. Now, in recent years, our scholars have gone through and tried to piece their history together, and it's painstaking and difficult. We've tried to put it together pharaoh by pharaoh and try to figure out from various sources how long each pharaoh ruled, and was he ruling concurrently with another pharaoh who was located in another part of Egypt. And we have tried to develop something of a chronology, but the chronology is not perfect. Now, this leads to problems because, for instance, in the Bible it will say Abraham visited Pharaoh. Then later Isaac visited Pharaoh. Then Joseph stood before Pharaoh and was Pharaoh's chief servant. Then Moses told Pharaoh, "Let my people go." In each instance, who was this Pharaoh? Now, granted, from Abraham to Moses was at least 400 years. There have been scholars who think that they know. The problem is, I read recently 4 different scholars who came with 4 different pharaohs for Abraham. They also came with 3 different pharaohs for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So, but we're trying. We are trying, and eventually we might make a good case for who these pharaohs were once we have sorted through the distortion that the Egyptians deliberately made of their history. And they may wonder, how could they distort their history? Simply this way, folk. Only their scholars had access to their writings and their learning. They called them priests. The priests served as their doctors, their scientists, their other professors, and of course their priests, all in one. In the land of Egypt, as was the case of the ancient world, there was no conflict between science and theology. They didn't have a debate between a scientist and a priest, and the scientist argued one thing. Science, theology, politics were all united into one field, and they did not compartmentalize their knowledge. Not like a modern-day politician who will say, well, on a personal level, I don't believe in this, but when I'm in government, I'll let you do your own thing. Modern-day politicians can do this, fine, but in the ancient world, everything was black or white. The right was right, the wrong was wrong. There was no conflict between politics, science, and theology. Again, they felt like they could. Yes.
When did the pharaohs start wearing the funny hats?
Start what?
Wearing the funny hats.
Oh, I do not know when they first started, but all kings down through the age wore what we might call crowns. Now, the pharaohs had a poisonous, a replica of a poisonous snake, among other things. I'll get to that in a minute, but they might have been doing that from the very beginning. Now, another thing about the geography, it wasn't just that the climate was regular. They were isolated from the other parts of humanity. Somewhat like the United States was isolated when it was growing up. The United States was separated from Europe by 4,000 miles of ocean, from Asia by an even bigger ocean. And eventually we made peace with Canada. Now, Mexico has not always been friendly. But except for the Indians living among us, we didn't have a whole lot of enemies during our formative years in the 19th century. We were somewhat isolated. Egypt was perhaps even more isolated. They had the Red Sea on one side, a huge desert all around them, the biggest desert in the world, isolating them from everybody else. And then there was the Mediterranean Sea isolating from the north. The isolation, though, did not prevent trade, but it did make it difficult for their enemies to come in and conquer. So, the desert, you might think, well, the desert made it easy for the armies to get through. Yes and no. Armies can die of thirst going through a desert. But the hot desert also is known to have weakened armies. So they were protected by their geography more so than most other countries were. Now, start off. We divide Egyptian history by dynasties, and they don't give each dynasty a name. The dynasties are known as First Dynasty, Second Dynasty. Not like the Chinese, who we'll talk about later, who gave each of their dynasties a name. The Egyptian dynasties were simply First Dynasty, Second Dynasty, Third Dynasty, Fourth Dynasty, and so on. The First Dynasty, of course, and Second, Third, and Fourth were part of the Old Kingdom. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, and then finally the New Kingdom. Between these kingdoms, you have two intermediate periods, First Intermediate and Second Intermediate. The intermediate periods were periods of chaos, periods that where that there was no sound government, where that it seemed like there was a whole lot of civil war and civil unrest, a whole lot of famine. These were the intermediate periods. Eventually, order and stability would come, and then a new kingdom would arise that would be a little bit different from the one before it. All right, the Old Kingdom. It is believed that a king named Menes, whose name I will not write down, but M-E-N-E-S spelling, that will not be on the test. But anyway, King Menes was said to have united the two Egypts. The two Egypts were Upper and Lower Egypt, with Upper Egypt being the south, yes, I said that right, and Lower Egypt being the north. And I think, how come they call the south upper? Because we point our maps always with the north, we think of north as up. But the fact is, the reason the south was called Upper Egypt was the south was higher above the sea, and north was lower, closer to sea level. So they were going downhill, so they logically thought, well, yeah, Upper Egypt is south because it's higher, and Lower Egypt is lower because it's lower, so therefore it was the north. So the two Egypts apparently at one time were two separate countries, and then along came a king who united them. And they claimed that they were united from the time of Menes all the way till modern times. They claim that is questionable at best. Now, folk, here's the enigma about the Old Kingdom. All of your pyramids, and there are more than 100 of them that still stand, and probably a few more that have fallen to ruin. But all of the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom. In addition, during the Old Kingdom, there was a canal. I don't believe your book mentions this, but there was a canal that joined the Nile River to the Red Sea. Later, Egyptian pharaohs were not even able to keep the canal open. Sandstorms would come along. I mean, every once in a while, Egypt would have a little bit of turmoil, or maybe a big rainstorm would come along and silt the canal up. And the pharaohs that came along later were not even able to keep it open. But remnants of this canal still exist. We can tell where it went, but it can no longer hold any boats because, for the most part, it doesn't have any water anymore. It's filled up, silted up. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, the farther back you go in time, the more advanced they were. That is backwards from our way of thinking. In the modern world, we think that we're always progressing upward. And in my memory, and in your memory, we have. I mean, today's automobiles are better than they were when I was a kid. And my dad, this month it would be the transmission. Well, next month would be a wheel bearing. Then the next month would be a battery. The month after that would be a headlight. I mean, just something breaking down all the time about his car, one after another. Then it would be maybe another wheel bearing. Then the radiator would start leaking. And then, just one after another. A lot of times, and this was true even with sometimes with newer cars, even new cars in those days would give you trouble. Today, we have better methods of metal working, know more about what type of materials to use for what part on a car, and our cars don't give us that much trouble. But a generation ago, they were a pain. Now, the point I'm making is while we are progressing upward with time, at least in a form of scientific advancement, they were going downhill. And only in modern times have risen up. Now, you might have noticed that I didn't draw the modern times as high as I drew the ancient. Why is that? Because my suspicions are that the ancients actually had more on the ball than we do. And there's quite a bit of evidence for this, folk. A lot of books have been written on the topic. They knew about electroplating. Electroplating cannot be done without a flow of electric current. How did they generate electricity? We found some vases that appear to have had battery acid in them, the type of chemicals that would generate electricity. The famous Baghdad battery, hundreds of, maybe thousands of years old. And also, I've already the pyramids. If there were only the Great Pyramid, that would be a feat in itself. The fact is, folks, there are 100 of them in Egypt alone. And then you go around the world. There are pyramids here in Central America, particularly the biggest pyramid in the world. It's not as tall as the Great Pyramid of Egypt, but it has more mass. The biggest pyramid is the Pyramid at Capan in Central America. There are pyramids in South America, and I've heard that there are pyramids in Asia, particularly China and India. I cannot prove that yet, but I saw the one in Capan back in 1976, and yes, it is quite massive. I've never been to Egypt. Anyway, a big question has to remain: how did they build this thing? And folk, there have been scholars who have said that we, with our modern day cranes and modern day technology, could not put one together. That they used some kind of stone moving. Now, the pyramid was 480 feet high when it was finished. To get a stone that high, you would probably have to build a causeway. Then the causeway would have to get bigger and bigger and bigger as time went on. And somebody estimated the causeway itself would have to actually contain more material than the pyramid. However, folk, there's no evidence that a causeway ever existed. All of the material that would have been used for the causeway would have had to have been taken somewhere. And this is true for the other pyramids also. There's no evidence any of them were constructed with a causeway. The standard view is that they were burial places. And then supposedly their bodies were removed and taken from the pyramid to the Valley of the Kings, where they were buried. I do have a book in my house that says there's no evidence that any of them ever contained a body. That they actually were not burial places, which begs the question, well, if they were not, what were they? Now, in the case of the Great Pyramid, they put together the square at the bottom of the base is it's almost square, the circle, and of course the triangle. Now, if the pyramid were a circle instead of a triangle, the height of the pyramid is the right height that it would be if it were a half of a sphere. In other words, the half of a sphere would come to a certain height. The ratio of twice the height, would double the height, and give the ratio of the sides of twice the height is pi, carried out to the fourth decimal point. Now, if you've studied math, you know about pi. Pi goes on and on and on. We've carried out millions of places. It never ends, never repeats itself. Starts out 3.14159265354, something like that. I believe most of those digits are right. Not that I've ever had to use it for that accuracy. Most of the time when I've used it for practical applications, just 3 1/7 will do. But again, if you want to be more accurate, you've got to But pi was not accurately carried out to the fourth decimal point until the 1600s. And yet the ratio of twice the height to the area of the sides is pi carried out to the fourth decimal point. Why am I telling you all this? Some people believe it might have been a measuring tool. It's an exact fraction of the Earth's size, like something like 1/2500th of the Earth's size. Maybe it's 1/5000th, but it was meant to incorporate the units of measurement of the yard, the rod, the fathom, the inch, and even the meter, metric measurements, then the units of weight. Inside is a device called a sarcophagus, and when you measure the sarcophagus, it incorporates some modern day units of measurement. Have any of you heard any of this before? Okay. In other words, it might have been as a unit of measurement. Now, it gets a little bit weirder. No, I don't in any way mean to show off how much money I have. This is just a little American $1 bill. On the back of it, folk, here it is, right here. This is the Great Pyramid with its top detached. And on the detached top, it is an all-seeing eye that is capable, supposedly, of, like it says, seeing everything. According to, I know you have to wonder, by the way, this symbol has been on the back of the American dollar for probably 200 years, since the nation's founded. I believe that's right. You have to wonder, what is an Egyptian artifact doing on the back of American currency? But,
Illuminati?
what's that?
Not got nothing to do with the Illuminati?
You took the words out. It may have everything to do with everything. Secret organization. It's known that the American founding fathers, and I'll name them, some of them: Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, were Masons. With a few exceptions, most of our presidents have been Masons. Just a few. There is a story that the founding fathers believed that since the Great Pyramid was never finished, the United States was the nation that was destined to someday go in and finish the project. Mason, stone, pyramid, stone. That there is possibly a secret to stone moving that we don't know about. Hey folks, the ancient world is filled with examples of super heavy stones being moved impossibly, throughout to impossible heights. Again, I keep thinking of Cuzco in South America, where you have the ocean down here, then a cliff going straight up 13,000 feet. These stones were quarried at sea level and carried straight up 13,000 feet with no evidence of a trail. The stones are bigger than anything we could lift. And then set together. No two are identical, and yet they all interlock with perfect precision. They're interlocked like pieces of a puzzle. Any of you ever heard of this? Cuzco in South America? Then we've talked before the day is out about Stonehenge. Remarkable abilities to move stones. And folk, some of the stones in the Great Pyramid weigh 60 tons. You cannot get any amount of men. I mean, the amount of men it would take to lift that, it cannot be gotten around those stones. You know, you're saying that these men could have lifted a 60-ton monolith, that's another name for stone, by just simply all of them, when a foreman said heave, every one of them heaving at once. You can lift very large stones that way, no kidding. But 60 tons, you can't get enough men underneath it. It's believed that the stones were quarried some 600 miles away. Theoretically, they could be rolled on logs, but there are a couple of problems with that. Number one, there are no forests in Egypt. And number two, you start rolling a 60-ton monolith on a log. The log only lasts about 3 or 4 turns and has to be replaced. I mean, it just shatters the log to ribbons. But again, folks, there's no evidence even of a trail that led from where the stones were supposedly quarried to the pyramid. If they had floated down the Nile, again, they had needed some super heavy logs to have gotten actually no wooden vessel can hold a stone that heavy. And then you have the cataract. I mean, yeah, the Nile has cataracts. You have the problem of, well, when you come to a cataract, let's lift that stone out of the water, get it around the cataract, and put it back in. Then when we get to the site of the pyramid, let's raise it up about 200 feet and put it in place. I had a student ask me this time last year, do you have a rational explanation? Give me a rational explanation for how the pyramid was built. I said, I don't have one. I had someone else ask me one time online, can you give me any hard evidence for what you believe? I was with her. She said, well, how hard is the Great Pyramid? Is that hard evidence? Maybe that's not what she had in mind by hard evidence. But, folk, if the Great Pyramid of Giza were the only one, but actually, like I say, there are at least about 100 others besides that one, the pyramid of... it's called the Pyramid of Cheops. The pyramid of his son, Khephren, is not much smaller than the Great Pyramid. And the Pyramid of Khephren, by the way, has equal angled triangle. In other words, 60 degrees. All these sides are equal. The Great Pyramid was deliberately left head off. Now, there's a whole lot more mathematics I could give, but I don't know if any of you are mathematicians. Have any of you ever heard of a number called the golden section? 1.618.
You're talking about aspect ratios?
Yeah, aspects, yeah.
Facing those.
Yeah, excellent. Well, the one side of the pyramid, the length of one side to the height is the golden section.
But the Sumerians had that in essence too, and they talk about 1 and 60 and the ratios of 1 and 6. I mean, if they understand the concept of a circle, you can understand the concept of spheres, you can understand celestial movements.
Yeah, you've read up on it a little bit. Yeah. Anyone else? I mean, so we're looking like, most of you seem to be paying attention. I'm glad of that. But if you're hearing things you hadn't heard before, well, that's why I came. You don't have to believe it, folk. But hey, do your own research. I have. It took me years, but all right. I jumped ahead. Now, about the Old Kingdom, again, seems to be the most advanced. At this point, the Egyptians took the title of Pharaoh, which means great house or palace. Some people believe that in the land of Egypt, that everybody was a slave, even the Pharaoh. Huxley wrote a book many years ago entitled Brave New World. And also there was another book written called 1984. And these books depict a future where that everybody's whole life is programmed from the time before they're born to the time they die. Super programmed. Some people believe that this was Egyptian society. You were born to be what your father was. In other words, your father was a tanner, you were to be a tanner. If your father was a soldier, you were expected to be a soldier. Your father was again, I was talking to the men. The women were expected to marry and bear children and not have a profession as such. If your father were a priest, you were expected to be a priest. Now, yes?
So a caste system of occupation, basically?
Yeah, that is an excellent way to put it. So it's sort of a caste system of occupations. Now, I believe this contributed to Egypt's downfall. Because, let's face it, folk, if your father were a priest, that does not in any way mean that you're qualified to be a scholar or a doctor or whatever other functions a priest were expected to do. And like one student pointed out this morning, one of the reasons that the knowledge that the Egyptians had may have been lost was they confined it to a few secret, highly select groups who kept it secret and modified it any way they wanted. If they had tried to educate the populace, number one, they could not have distorted their history. That's one, and also their knowledge might not have been lost. For any society, they lose their knowledge when one generation fails to teach the next. Grandparents can't teach the grandchildren, not that much. Each generation has to teach the next. And when that fails, it's all lost. And it will take a long time to recover. After a period of chaos, there came the Middle Kingdom, During the Middle Kingdom, they no longer seemed to have the resources to build the pyramids. But they did at least build a lot of temples. The Egyptians kept on building throughout. Then you come to the Second Intermediate Period, which I'll get to later. But first, your book goes on to society. As was the case of all ancient societies, most of your people were farmers. The priests were a few select group of people. The Pharaoh was at the top, and under him was the nobility. Yes, there was the army. But the majority of people worked the land, as was the case in almost all ancient society. Actually, all ancient societies. It's only been in the modern world we figured out how that one person in 20 or less can be a farmer, and they can feed everybody in the country and everybody in other countries also. All right. Now, religion. Yes?
This is the wrong book. Because I took the picture from the desk.
That is the wrong book. Let me see. Is that right from Spielberg? Oh, no. This is definitely the wrong book.
I took the picture in the class.
Well, it's not my book. No, this one. This one's right. That one's right. They have it, but it's green. That one is not even by the same authors. It's far from. I'm sorry, but some of your classmates are carrying it. All right. Yeah, I see one here. All right. Religion. In the land of Egypt, unlike in the land of Mesopotamia, Pharaoh was looked on as being God. And all the line of pharaohs were looked on as being a line of gods. If you ever watched The Lion King, it pictured the lion, and his lion was in a list of all of his ancestors all the way back to the beginning of time were gods. They yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but you're on the Middle Kingdom now, right?
Well, actually, I'm past the kingdom on and moving on to their religion, which applies to. I'm giving a vast overview of the whole thing, all the way from the old kingdom all the way down.
Oh,
I've compartmentalized it into religion, like your book does. So, now, granted, the religious practices did vary from time to time, but there were certain practices that remained the same. And one of them was that the Pharaoh was God. Now, the pharaohs had a knack for dressing with headdresses that some would point out appeared to be weird. And again, this was to set them apart from everybody else. Being God, of course, that meant the pharaoh had to live in awful isolation from his people. Otherwise, somebody might figure out that he really wasn't God. But he associated with his people through his servants. Now, as time went on, from the old kingdom to the middle kingdom, the pharaoh appeared to be more in touch with his people. And in the old kingdom, he just seemed to be living in somewhat awesome isolation. Now, about their gods. The Egyptians had an affinity for gods that had human bodies, but heads, particularly two types of heads. Heads of falcons, falcon heads, or cats. Yes, the Egyptians looked on the cat as being sacred. And their pharaohs were often, or their gods were often pictured with cat heads. There's a lot more I could say about that, folk, believe me, but I'll leave it for now. Now, the chief deity, whose name I really want you to remember, is Isis.
Excuse me, I got a question.
Yes.
Why the cat?
Why the cat? I'm not sure, and I really don't know how much I want to get into that, but some people go so far as to say that they believe that they crossbred humans with animals, that they knew how to do it. Now, again, the Greeks had centaurs, part man and part horse. I mean, if any biology teacher would tell you today that's impossible. But, now, we don't know, I can't prove that, except to say that what you can find out with just a little bit of research, they seem to like to picture humans crossed with certain animals, particularly the cat. Why the cat? Maybe because it has more of an affinity to take up with humans than a lot of animals do. Talk about your domestic house cat. Again, I already said more than I intended to say. Thanks for asking. Yes, thanks for asking. Now, Isis. All right, in the story of Isis, Isis had a son named Osiris. Now, in some cases, Osiris is listed as her husband, and in some stories, Osiris is listed as both her son and her husband. But anyway, Osiris was killed, and Isis went to the netherworld, chased him down to try to get him back. Actually, when Osiris was killed, he was hacked into 13 pieces, and the 13 pieces were sent all over the world as a reminder, hey, if you do as Osiris has done, you'll be hacked into pieces also. Well, Isis went around the world and collected the 13 pieces and put them together, and she made an agreement with the netherworld, but in the agreement, she had to take his place in the netherworld for 6 months. So Isis would go down in the netherworld among the dead for 6 months so that her son could come back up. Then her son would go down for the other 6. But Isis and her son never saw each other. It was just when they were passed, when one of them was passing from the lower world to the upper world, they did not meet. Now, I get mixed up which is which, but I believe that when one of them was up in the upper world, it was summer. When that same one was in the lower world, it was winter. But I don't know which one was which, but one of them brought in summer and winter. Isis was said to be the mother of all things, the creator of the universe, the creator of all. She didn't start out there, that's where she became. And she's important because when the worship of other gods tended to die out, she was worshipped, particularly when the Greeks lost interest in their gods. They took up an interest in Isis. When the Romans also lost interest in their gods, a lot of them began to worship Isis. And then when Christianity took over the Western world, some people will say that Christianity incorporated Isis, that Isis became Mary, and her son became Jesus, and Osiris became Jesus, and it was just a neat, almost seamless incorporation down through time. And there are all kinds of stories, folks, that Isis has been worshipped all the way down through time in secret meetings and secret societies, all the way down through the ages, including today. The name Isis has a way of rearing its head from time to time. Again, I could go into more detail, but obviously all of you, I'm sure, have heard that a new group that just has risen within the last year calls itself ISIS, and they have to be aware. I mean, our president calls them ISIL for whatever reason, I don't know, but they call themselves ISIS. They have to be aware that ISIS is the name of a goddess who lived way back there, who was responsible for bringing summer and winter, responsible supposedly for creating the universe and for bringing life. Have any of you heard any of this from other sources? I'm just curious. No hands going up. In the morning's class, some of them had. Anyway, eventually, the Egyptians began to put morality into the religion. Now, folks, this is something we'll talk about when we come to Hebrews. In the beginning, it seems like religion and morality were separate and had nothing to do with each other. That's strange because in the modern world, we associate morals with religion, but the Egyptians eventually came to do that also. Now, it's obvious that the Egyptians were polytheistic. However, there was one pharaoh named Akhenaton. I'm not going to write the name down, but one pharaoh tried to make Egypt a monotheistic country, and he destroyed all the gods except the god Aten, who he said was the only one in the pantheon. He died, and his son undid everything he had done. It's as though the Egyptians resisted any and all attempts to become monotheistic, that is, until the rise of Christianity. Otherwise, they embraced their polytheistic ways to a hilt. Now, oh yes, the Egyptians' concept of a soul was the ka. I'm going to write that in italics. They oftentimes pictured the ka as being a falcon that would detach itself from the body at death, and the ka then was the part of the person that went to the netherworld. And they had a list of things, 10 of them, that they put into what they called their Book of the Dead. They would memorize these 10 things. It's like they're similar to the 10 Commandments. In fact, a lot of authors have made a comparison. I mean, after all, Moses was schooled in Pharaoh's household. But the Book of the Dead was something you were to go to the next life and tell the gods basically how good you'd been. And you were to recite, I never moved my neighbor's landmark. Of course, this is a big problem in Egypt because when a flood came over, they depended on landmarks to notice where their land ended and the neighbor's land began. And it's known as sometimes an Egyptian would pick up a landmark and kind of scoot it a few feet over in his favor. But he was to say to the gods, I never moved my neighbor's landmark. No lie passed through my lips. Again, folks, I don't know how anybody can say that, but nevertheless they would say it. I am no adulterer, and etc. and etc. They were to, or I never stole. They were to give 10 things that they memorized as to how good they'd been. And if the gods agreed with them, the gods would take them into their kingdom. All right, so much for the time being for Egyptian religion. Their art, they were, a lot of the art had to do with the afterlife. It seems like the Egyptians were really concerned about the afterlife. And a lot of their pharaohs, which would bury their treasures with them, believing that what they buried with them they would take with them into the next life. And they would be buried with food, with water. Of course, the upper classes were mummified. We now, at one time, we said we didn't know how they were mummied, but now we know that we think we know the processes. They would take out their internal organs and put tar or pitch inside them. Now, also, in Egypt's very, very dry climate, you can bury a body of a person, and that body will remain intact for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, because the dry sand will sap away all the water and prevent decay. And some persons who we know were not mummified, we find their graves in the bodies in a remarkably good state of preservation because of the, again, extreme dry climate. But their mummies was designed to preserve their bodies, which they believed would help them in the afterlife. And they would try to carry their treasure with them. Now, unfortunately, grave robbers came in and took a lot of the treasure, which brings us up to King Tut, or King Tutankhamun. No, I'm not going to ask you to memorize that name. King Tut's mummy was, in fact, brought to Atlanta a few years back, and he was placed on display at the Atlanta Civic Center. I did not bother to go see it. I mean, I tried to tell my wife there's so many things that's important to see, and I just can't get around to seeing them all. But some things I do, and some I don't. Anyway, King Tut really, it turned out he was not all that important and only lived about 21 years and probably was suffering from some horrible diseases and a crippled hand and maybe a crippled leg also. God had been deformed. But what makes him important was when we found him, his treasure had not been touched because nobody had violated his tomb for about 3,000 years since he'd been buried. And so we were able to determine a lot about what the pharaohs buried themselves with. And of course, burying themselves with all this gold and gems, precious stones and whatever, silver, all this depleted the wealth of later pharaohs and might have been one reason why the Egyptian empire declined as time went on. They buried too much of their wealth in their tombs. Egyptian writing is called hieroglyphics. You've all seen And it's like cuneiform. Well, it doesn't look like cuneiform, but it resembles cuneiform, though, in that you have to learn thousands upon thousands of symbols. And even in an entire lifetime, you might probably not learn every symbol there was to learn. No two symbols were alike. And you'd have to memorize, well, this symbol means this, and this symbol means that. And again, that was their writing. The idea of writing with phonetics, that was to come later with the Phoenicians. And again, only a few people learn how to read or write. Well, yeah, your book does mention Akhenaton there at the bottom of page 21. Anyway, things declined. The Middle Kingdom declined, and they went through a period of chaos. During the period of decline, though, there was a queen who took over named Hatshepsut. She was just about the only queen, and she got power the way a whole lot of queens have down through history. And this was true more than once in China, maybe only true once in Egypt's history. She was the wife of a pharaoh. And when that pharaoh died and left a son who was not old enough to be pharaoh, the mother would take over, and she would pretend, oh yeah, my son's pharaoh, he'll be pharaoh when he grows up. But then when the son grew up, she would find a convenient way to get rid of him, either imprison him or even worse, kill him. And she would retain the power herself by getting a few of her trusted lords on her side, by promising them all kinds of favors if they would keep her in power. And this was the way she kept and maintained power, by these means. Hatshepsut was no exception. She was the wife of one pharaoh and therefore the mother of another. But the pharaoh she was the mother of was not old enough. When she died, her son took all the memorabilia from her and threw it in a garbage can or a trash heap. And it remained in a trash heap for some 2,000 years, 3,000 years. Then eventually archaeologists found the trash heap and found some remarkably preserved statues, fully painted, that were still in a remarkably good state of preservation, again owing to the dry Egyptian climate. And we think that she might have been a fairly good-looking, perhaps intelligent woman. But the Egyptians did not like the idea of a woman ruling over them, and they tried to destroy all of her memory. Again, the Egyptians engaged in distortion of history, and this makes it difficult for us to decipher what kind of history they had. Marriages were arranged. So was the Chinese. In fact, I'll just tell you now that Chinese and Egyptians had a lot in common. And if you look at the DNA chart, you will find that the Chinese may have originated in the area of Egypt or the area of Canaan, and spread on into China from the area of Egypt. Their writing looks alike. Their preoccupation with life after death is a lot alike. And they numbered, well, the Chinese named their dynasties, but they created their history around their dynasties. To the south of Egypt was the land of Nubia. I'll have more to say about Nubia later. It's known that Nubians and Egyptians, though, copied each other. The Nubians had pyramids, but their pyramids were nothing the size of the Egyptians. And in fact, a Nubian dynasty, a black dynasty, might have ruled Egypt for a time. One of their dynasties might have been black. The Nubians in general were black. The Egyptians at this time might have been a mixture of black and white. All right, Indo-Europeans, moving on. The Indo-Europeans were the people living in this part of the world, and at some point they spread out. One group went through Persia, the people who settled here became the Persians. Their relatives went on into India, and they were known as the Aryans. We'll have more to say about that in chapter 2. Another group went in here and settled in the Greeks. They were called the Hellenes, and they became the Greeks. Another group went in here and became the Latins, and another group went in here and they became the Franks. But they seem to have started out in this region between the Caspian and Black Seas, into this region called Caucasian, the Caucasian region, and that's where we get the name Caucasian. They seem to have first been a wandering people or nomads. The word nomad means people who live in tents and who go from one place to place either to feed their flocks or to follow the herds. When they eat up all the grass in one area, they would go to another. When they drink up all the water in a water hole or in an oasis, they'll go to another area. They seem to have been nomadic. But the Indo-Europeans, like the Egyptians and like a lot of other ancient peoples, had a knack for building huge stone structures. Your book mentions the Stonehenge. But actually the Stonehenge is one of at least 10,000 stone structures. And I have a book at home, and the author said, I'm not going to mention Stonehenge because you can look that up anyway. There's been a lot written about it already. But his goal was just simply to list as much as he knew about each stone structure in Europe. And they all have two things in common. Number one, they're made of stone. And number two, nobody knows who built any one of them. It's just these structures from the time the first records were kept, they were there. They were uninhabited. They were obviously dwelling places. They have doors, even though the door is all along probably made of wood, long since rotted away. They probably had roofs made of wood because that's all rotted away. But the stone walls are there with windows and doors, and nobody has dwelt in them for maybe 3,000 years. But they're all over the place in Europe. The most famous one is the Stonehenge. The Stonehenge was designed to where, on Midsummer Day, in other words, June 21st, the sun would form a perfect shadow, provided there were no clouds in the sky, would form a perfect shadow in the center of the circle of stones. Now, it's known that these stones have been moved at least twice, and maybe more, picked up and shifted. And why would they have to shift? Well, maybe the earth shifted, or maybe the island of England shifted. The Stonehenge is located in England, but folks, some persons say that the stones that were built it were quarried in Ireland. That which leads to the problem, how did they get those stones from Ireland to England? And I'll say this again, repeat what I said earlier, no wooden ship, no wooden boat that we know of could carry them. Wherever the stones that were used were not quarried where they're located. Even if the stones were quarried somewhere on the island of Great Britain, we have no idea how they were moved from where they were quarried to where they're located now. Simply a mystery, as is the case of all the ancient, what you call megaliths, a Greek word meaning large stone. Hittites. The main thing what you remember about the Hittites, they're believed to be the first people to use iron, and this gave an advantage in battlefield. Let's face it, an iron sword is better and will hold a point better and will last better in battle than a sword made of copper or bronze or brass. Iron nails will hold better than brass nails. Chariots of iron will hold together better in a battle than will chariots of brass or chariots of copper. Iron is generally considered a stronger metal, and eventually people learned to take iron and make steel, but that's jumping into the story a little bit. But the Hittites ushered in what we used to call the Iron Age. We go from the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, New Stone Age, Bronze Age, and finally the Iron Age. A Hittite king sacked Babylon once. Now, I want to say this about the Hittites, folk. The Bible mentions them several places, and a lot of critics used to say, well, that proves the Bible's a myth because no Hittites ever existed. And I want to say this, folk, about you cannot ever state a negative. In other words, before you state that dinosaurs don't exist, you have to have been able to look all over the whole globe and every nook and cranny at once. And folk, that's impossible. To say a group of people didn't exist means you'd have to go back in time and know everybody who existed at all times. So you're always on infirm ground when you make a statement like there is no evidence. There's evidence for everything. But anyway, we finally found out not only did the Hittites exist, they were really powerful. And a Hittite king went down in the days of Hammurabi's grandson and sacked the city of Babylon. The king's name was Shupoluliumus, so I'm not going to write that down. I learned that name when I was in school. The other kids in my class used to make fun of those names and others. I mean, the ancient world had names like Tiglath-Pileser, Shupoluliumus, Lugal-Zagissi, and names that we think are kind of comical today. Anyway, turned out that the Hittites did leave a lot of records, and we do know a little bit about them. Now, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians lived on the eastern Mediterranean in what is today Lebanon. Their two main cities were Tyre and Sidon, but they were a coastal people, seagoing people. And they went all over the Mediterranean, that we're sure of. And the city of Carthage, which we'll talk about when we come to Rome, because Rome fought a long, long series of wars against Carthage. The city of Carthage was started by them. But their main contribution to civilization was this word Phoenicians, who think it looks like phonics. There's their alphabet. They gave the world an alphabet of only 22 symbols, and each symbol had its own unique sound. The Phoenician alphabet was copied by the Greeks, even though we don't use the Greek alphabet. I mean, the Greek alphabet has symbols like this, and so on and so forth. But the Phoenicians gave their alphabet to the Romans. The Romans created the Latin alphabet that we still use. Almost all Western European countries today use the Roman alphabet, which was a copy from the Phoenicians. And a lot of people quickly learn, hey, this is better because you only have to learn 22 symbols. And then if you learn the correct spelling of words, it's a whole lot easier to learn, a whole lot easier to read, and a whole lot easier to write. Now, there is more to be said about the Phoenicians than their tricks. There have been scholars, and Cyrus Gordon by name, he's now deceased, but Cyrus Gordon was finding Phoenician artifacts here in the land of Brazil, the Amazon region. He was finding Phoenician artifacts in the area of Minnesota at the end of the Great Lakes. And he was finding Phoenician artifacts way over here in Java, Southeast Asia. And my graduate professor just simply would say, it sounds fantastic. That was really not a good argument against him, but he couldn't disprove it. I personally think it's highly possible that indeed the Phoenicians did travel all over the globe. They loved the sea. One of the kings of the Phoenicians was a close friend of King Solomon in the Bible. And he and Solomon's men got together and went to a place called Ophir and carried back a whole lot of gold. And our question remains, well, where is Ophir? We don't know. But I've read articles that would say it's over here, it's over here, it's down here. We simply do not have enough info to tell where the land of Ophir was. All right. Actually, your book says Phoenicians are now known to have not been the only people who used an alphabet, but theirs is more significant than the rest of them to us because their alphabet was incorporated into the Latin language and then incorporated into ours. All right, which takes us up to the Hebrews, the children of Israel. Now, again, I'm not going to try to get through the whole children of Israel thing in the 10 minutes we have left, but I'll at least start. The number one contribution of children of Israel to the humanity was monotheism. And any person living in the years from between 2000 and 1000 BCE, if that person could wake up and come to modern times, they would really be shocked to find that a lot of the world's people today are monotheistic, the ones who have any religious convictions at all. Because monotheism was almost wiped out during this time period until there were probably hardly any monotheistic people left. There was a hint that one of the pharaohs tried to become monotheist but didn't. And I'm going to go over what the significance of that is later. But their monotheism was to influence Christianity and Islam, both of which came later. Anyway, according to their own story, they were descended from Abraham. Now, folks, I want to say that the last time I looked up Abraham on the internet, and you might can tell I do a lot of internet research, one author said Abraham did not exist. There's a certain type of bad. In fact, I started to put that same quote in the paper that I was signing, and it's not too controversial, better not, so I didn't. There's something very illogical about that. Every one of us sitting here in this room or standing like me, every one of us had some ancestor who lived around the year 1800 BCE. If we didn't, then we're not here. You understand the logic? You had to have ancestors that lived at that time. Therefore, whether or not Abraham that they claimed is this right person or not, somebody who is their ancestor had to have lived in 1800 BCE. Now, the logic they use that all the kings mentioned in connection with Abraham you can't find anywhere. You can. Again, if you unjumble some of the chronology that the ancients were known to jumble up. If you believe the biblical chronology, you can find, even though in the case of the pharaohs, it's a little bit difficult, three scholars, you come with 3 pharaohs who might have been the pharaoh whom Abraham visited. The one I like best, though, is the pharaoh that Abraham visited was the same pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid at Giza. And according to Josephus, Abraham visited Pharaoh and gave to Pharaoh all the mathematics necessary to build the pyramid, and then the Pharaoh put them together. And so the Pharaoh of Abraham was the Pharaoh Cheops, and the Pharaoh of Isaac, Abraham's son, was his son Kephren, who built the next biggest pyramid in Egypt. But again, you can't quite prove that, owing to the fact that the Egyptians are known to have deliberately distorted their history. Anyway, all the ancient peoples believed that they were descended from one man and his maybe more than one wife. And in the case of the Israelites, they were descended from one man and his 4 wives. You might wonder how come that marrying more than one wife was legal. They had to, because wars and other events took away a lot of the men. And the men who survived had to somewhat double up in order for the human race to survive. So it was necessary at that time for a lot of the men to have more than one wife. Abraham did, and Israel, which otherwise known as Jacob, also did. Anyway, they started out, according to the story, as nomadic herdsmen wandering from place to place. Now, there are scholars who believe that Abraham was actually a member of Sumerian royalty. It's known that he came from Ur, and that he got out of Ur before Ur was destroyed. And the destruction of Ur might have led to the famine that forced Abraham to go to Egypt in the first place. There were numerous famines mentioned in the Bible from time to time, something we are not familiar with. Anyway, Abraham was the father of Isaac, who in turn was the father of Jacob, known as Israel. Israel and his 12 sons, who became the 12 tribes, went to Egypt, and their descendants lived in Egypt for 400 years. At first they were guests. They were given the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen was the place where the Nile River would flow, and then all of a sudden it went all over the place to empty into the Mediterranean Sea. The Egyptians did not consider the land of Goshen to be part of Egypt because it would change every year. The tributaries, but the delta, that's what they call it. Delta would move and shift the land, and they couldn't stand that kind of irregularity. So Pharaoh, Pharaoh at that time gave Israel the land of Goshen, and eventually made slaves of them. And for 400 years they were slaves in Egypt. During this time, one of them, named Moses, was found by Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter adopted him. And Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, which might have explained why he was seemingly so well educated and so well versed in Egyptian history, but not in the Egyptian religion. All right, Moses. Moses was a favorite among American slaves 150 or 200 years ago, and it doesn't take much to see why. Moses was famous among slaves because he freed the slaves in the biblical account. And therefore, he became really popular, and the Africans would get together on Sunday and preach about Moses, how Moses went to Pharaoh and said, Pharaoh, let my people go. Now, there have been several movies made about this event, and one of the movies was the Ten Commandments, made about close to 50 years ago. And understand the props used to make the Ten Commandments were still there in the Egyptian desert. It would cost too much to remove them, so they left them there. The Ten Commandments featured, let's see, I believe Elizabeth Taylor. I'm mixed up with Cleopatra. But anyway, the props were still there. Another one was Prince of Egypt, which was an animated cartoon that a lot of your generation might have watched. My daughters watched it over and over again, Prince of Egypt. Now, there was recently a movie made called Exodus, which I had not happened to see, but there's a movie about the same thing. Any of you seen it by any chance? Yeah, okay. The authors of Exodus have answered the critics. The critics will say, no, you cannot find anything in Egyptian records that has anything to do with the Exodus. This is told by the Hebrews. But this critic says, yes, you can. The Tel El Amarna letters, I'm not going to write that down, but Tel El Amarna describes 6 of the 10 plagues almost with the same accuracy or the same place. The problem with these Tel El Amarna letters are dated some 400 or 500 years removed from the Hebrew account of the Exodus. But this man says if you simply unravel Egyptian chronology and move the Tel El Amarna letters to the time of the Exodus, you get the Exodus happening right, at least 6 of the 10 plagues that are mentioned right there. And it was, apparently these letters describe a very terrible, horrible time for the Egyptians. And the slave uprising they talk about where the slaves no longer obey their masters, they do describe some of the plagues, that the land is filled with famine and want, and hailstones have fallen down. There's several things mentioned in these letters that do seemingly describe some of the plagues. So again, if you unravel the Egyptian chronology, and also some people believe that the Exodus coincides with the second intermediate period, a time of great chaos in Egypt. And the second intermediate period ended when an army came in called the Hyksos, or a group called the Hyksos, and they conquered Egypt. Why were they able to do it? Well, Pharaoh had no army anymore. There was no army. Pharaoh's army was drowned in the Red Sea. So the Hyksos realized, hey, if there's no army in Egypt, let's go in. And they went in, conquered and ruled Egypt for a few generations and became one of the dynasties. Again, secular history will say, oh no, these events you're describing happen at different times and do not line up with Hebrew chronology. Others say, well, it's the Egyptian chronology the fault. They do line up. All right, I'm going to have to stop there.